Hello everyone, Loremaster of Sotek here, and before we get too much into it, I know, it's been a while. It's been a long while. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But before we talk about any of that, I want to go ahead and just make a video, because it's been a while. So I'm going to actually do a Q&A video today. I originally was going to put out the next Legendary Lord video for patrons today, but I kind of wanted to give everybody something to watch. Instead of just patrons. So patrons, I'll have out y'all's first lore video in quite some time tomorrow. And then for everyone else, it'll come out on like Wednesday probably. So look forward to that. It's a long one, but it's gonna be good. I think y'all are gonna really like it. So instead, what I'm gonna do today is I have a bunch of leftover questions from when I was gonna do the Dark Elf Q&A. So I'm gonna go ahead and answer those questions, and also answer a few other random questions I've seen around. And then after we do all that, we'll talk about kind of what's the future plan and things that are going on and all that stuff. So without further ado, I am back, and let's get right to it. Alright, today's first question comes from Canovia, who has a question about the Dark Elves, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase what he says. But essentially he asks, is there any solid pre-end times evidence about the storyline of Malekith being the true chosen of Assurin, meaning the Phoenix King? So, the basic answer to this is no. When you look at pre-end times lore, excluding a little bit of fudginess that they pull in 8th edition, which was of course a lead up to the end times, Malekith was initially and canonically rejected from the Flame because Assurin saw the evil in his heart and refused to acknowledge him as the Phoenix King, and he was burned for what he had done. Because at that point, he had basically murdered, of course, Belshazzar by poisoning him, and then he had brutally murdered, a bunch of High Elf princes in the Shrine of Assurin, who he considered political threats. So he basically did a bunch of butchery on Assurin's front doorstep, and then walked through the flames saying, alright, I'm your chosen one, I am the Phoenix King now, you have to acknowledge me. And Assurin basically was like, yeah, no, that's not going to happen. And that's why Malekith was horribly burned, and managed to throw himself out of the fire, and then of course everything that happened afterwards did. What the End Times decided to do was it did, retcon the lore to that what actually happened, quote unquote, was that Malekith walked into the flame and it hurt him so badly that he basically thought, oh shit, I'm gonna die, and threw himself out the way he had come. So because he didn't walk all the way through the fire, he didn't complete the ritual properly. Which is a bit of a weird thing to say. It's not a dumb theory necessarily, but it is a little bit of a stretch. Because Assurin did die, or not Assurin, Anarion did pretty much die in the flames. Like, Anarion walked into the flames of Assurin and literally just burnt to a crisp. And then Assurin basically brought him back and rebuilt him. That being said, my preferred version of the storyline, and one that I consider canon, for most of the times if I'm like teaching the lore, is that Malekith was rejected because of the darkness that was in his heart, and because of the fact he was a murdering bastard, and not because he didn't, sit in the oven long enough. He wasn't baked well enough to be the Phoenix King. So hopefully that answers your question. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one. Our second question comes from Dalek, who asks, can the Black Arcs that the Dark Elves beach to use as core for their citadels, like in Naggaroth or Enlek, be lifted up once more, and what prevents them from making more, if anything? Alright, so most people are aware that Naggaroth has a couple of main cities, and what may not be readily apparent is that many of them are essentially a giant Black Arc, or sometimes even a collection of Black Arcs, depending on the city in question, that basically all beached in the same area and were regrounded, and they built a new empire around it. Obviously, Black Arcs still go out from time to time, so allow me to go ahead and answer the course of this question. First of all, can Black Arcs be relocated? Yes. Black Arcs, the enchantments that was used to make them, they are able to still rumble to life, and be moved if necessary. The Dark Elves usually wouldn't do this with most of them unless it was an emergency, just because they're pretty well established and they have roads connecting various Black Arcs and all this other stuff, and moving them together would be incredibly difficult. But it would be possible to remove the Black Arcs from, say, Nagarond or Klarkarond and stuff like that, and get them back moving again. Obviously, the Dark Elves have built some cities since then that are not based on Black Arcs, that are more inland, so those wouldn't be able to go anywhere, like most of Garand would be stuck. But notable portions of the founding cities and all the cities you would find along that massive strait that cuts into the north part of Nagaroth, where most of the Dark Elf cities are located, most of them could still move if they needed to. And if Malekith were to feel confident, per se, in a full-scale invasion of Ulthuan, he would probably order all of the Black Arcs to get up and move. The second part of this question is, what prevents them from making more, if anything? So, to the best of my knowledge, because this subject isn't approached too much, it is impossible to make more Black Arcs. The only reason the Black Arcs were capable of being unleashed is because basically when during the Sundering, at the very, very end of the Sundering, when Malekith was losing the Civil War, he basically threw a Hail Mary that you kind of learn about if you've played the Vortex campaign in Warhammer 2, and Malekith's Hail Mary was to try and undo the Vortex and unleash chaos on the world and take advantage of the situation. Well, and it was kind of more of like a, if I can't have Ulthuan, then nobody can have Ulthuan, and he was just going to burn everything. So Malekith and all of his sorcerers, all of them, throw this huge spell at the Vortex, but unknown to them, Kalidor was still alive inside the Vortex, which was not really common knowledge at this point. And Kalidor basically was able, despite maintaining the Vortex, was able to literally just take those spells and just throw them right back. And so all of this horrendous magic reflected at the Dark Elves and completely just crippled Nagaroth, which was that northeastern or northwestern part of Ulthuan where Anlek and all those other cities were. So all the cities that were Black Arcs, basically the spell rebounded and it just fucked most of Ulthuan. And this is what kind of gave the Sundering its really big, heavy name, is that when that spell reflected, Ulthuan itself was destabilized. So there were earthquakes, and there were like hundreds of, like, we're talking like miles high tidal waves that completely wiped out entire kingdoms. This is where most of the outer kingdoms were completely broken, and basically lost a lot of their former power. Like Tiranoc in particular and Nagaroth were crippled by this. Nagaroth was turned into a wasteland that was just cracked and broken. Most of the other kingdoms suffered, thousands, if not more, millions of casualties, but survived in bits and pieces. But for the Black Arcs, and this kind of answers another question someone else asked. Oh, this is actually the next question. Kat asked, aren't Black Arcs literally cities from Ulthuan that got uprooted and used to escape on? Yes, they are massive cities, city fortresses that were typically in the northern parts of Ulthuan, but there were some in other places. They were just loyalist to Malekith. And basically, when the spell rebounded, all of them went, oh shit, we're all gonna die. Because it wasn't a question of, like, if your tower would survive the natural disasters and calamities that were being caused by the rebound. Everybody was gonna die, no question. So Malekith and all of them basically invented a spell on the fly that used all of that energy that was coursing around Ulthuan to basically break off the land, the very earth beneath their cities, and turn them into floating fortresses using magic. And basically they all just retreated off to the northwest and eventually went on to found Nagaroth. And of course, Black Arcs now are much more reliable as ships than they were in that particular period, because while they're sustained and held up by magic, they're also nowadays carried on the backs of like giant sea monsters that pull them much, much faster, and they're much better designed as sea fortresses than the original ones. So, have there been any new Black Arcs since the Sundering? No, I don't believe so. That being said, Black Arcs tend to suffer from typical elf syndrome, and what I mean from that is that in the lore, Black Arcs just kind of show up, and there's basically as many Black Arcs as there needs to be, just like there's as many elves as there needs to be whenever you're reading stories based in the Warhammer Fantasy Universe. It's because in realistic terms, the Dark Elves probably only would have escaped Ulthuan with, at best, a few hundred Black Arcs. And granted, losing a Black Arc is an exceedingly rare event. Like, maybe once every couple of decades, a Black Arc gets taken down. Because most of them don't go anywhere because they're considered too valuable to lose, because they can't make any more of them. And they are basically incredibly valuable military cities. And this is why, when the Dark Elves invade Ulthuan, they use the Black Arcs to basically take entire cities that are pre-built, ready to go, have garrisons, technology, food, supplies, and they just park them onto Ulthuan. So they just like drop them back into Nagaryth, or up in the northern shores near the Shrine of Cain and stuff like that, the Broken Isles up there, and that's how they're able to cause full-scale invasions in an exceedingly short amount of time. Dark Elves are the best invaders in the world next to, like, demons, because they can just drop an entire city on top of you before you even know they're there, if you're not careful. So hopefully that answers your question about Black Arcs. So let's go ahead and move on to the next one. Our third question for today, or I guess fourth at this point, comes from Drethella Chillmane, which is a very Dark Elfy name, but it's from Izzy, so there's not a surprise, who asked, let's get this out of the way. The only mono-gendered units in the Dark Elven armies are the Witch Elves, the Sisters of Slaughter, and the Canine Assassins. True? I believe so, yes. So, Cain is one of the very, very few gods in the Warhammer Fantasy Universe who has like divided sex based on gender within his religion, at least the way the Dark Elves interpret his religion. So you have the Witch Elves, who are basically this sect of Cain. They're kind of like the priestesses of it, and they're known as the Brides of Cain, and that's why they're an all-female order, and they are the religious center for Cain in Dark Elf culture. And, of course, Dark Elf culture also kind of suffers from this whole thing about Malekith being really paranoid about really powerful males in his society, especially if they're magically inclined, which tends to include priests. So, most religious figures in Nagaroth tend to be women, and most religious orders tend to be heavily women, just because that makes Malekith feel better, because if you're a guy and you can kind of use magic, Malekith is really worried about a specific prophecy that tells that a sorcerer or a male who's gifted with sorcery is going to be his downfall and kill him. So the Cainites have kind of found this neat little niche for themselves in that they have a lot of powerful priestesses and all this other stuff, but they're an all-female order because they view themselves as Cain's consorts, which is why they're mostly naked most of the time, and their relationship with Cain is really, it's much more almost fetish than you would expect, which is why the Witch Elves dress the way they do and why they're so almost orgasmic in the way that they approach murder. And they tend to get really into it. Like, they take specific drugs and things that allow them to not really feel pain, which is why they fight pretty much naked on the battlefield. Because for them, murder is a performance, and it's an exaltation to Cain. And because they're his brides, this is kind of the way they, they commune with him. But for them, it's a very sexually charged relationship, which elves tend to have very emotional and emotionally packed relationships with pretty much everything. And the way the Dark Elves tend to interpret that is in very sadistic and cruel ways. And Witch Elves are, of course, one of the apexes of that. As for the other units, the Sisters of Slaughter are an all-female order. They're kind of like a gladiator or a gladiatorial group. They're more associated with Eldrazor, the Lord of Blades, who is one of the elven gods that we learned about in 8th edition, or was, I guess I should say, invented in 8th edition. He is one of the underworld gods, and he's one of the children of the god of destruction. And they're kind of like his religious order, though they're not so much a religion as they are kind of like a sport almost. They're these like apex gladiatorial fighters who basically go into these arenas in the major cities in the Dark Elf in Nagaroth and fight monsters and warriors and anything they actually can fight, in these epic displays to please the Lord of Blades, and of course for their own personal enjoyment. They find great satisfaction in it. The Sisters of Slaughter are basically the most apex of duelists the Dark Elves have. So it's pretty rare that they show up on the battlefield, but when they do, they are terrifying because they're insanely elite. And they're ones that, like I said, there's not a bunch of them, but they are an all-female order, and they're pretty wicked looking. If you have never seen a Sister of Slaughter, I'll probably have a picture up as the picture for this section, so you can enjoy that. And then the Canine Assassins, so the men within the Order of Cain have two possible fates. If they're on Death Night, which is an evening every year in which the servants of Cain basically go out in a crazed blood frenzy, kidnap everybody they can off the streets, including Dark Elves, like just regular Dark Elves who haven't done anything to deserve it, or slaves often as well. They'll basically kidnap all these people and drag them kicking and screaming to cauldrons of blood within the Shrines of Cain and just murder them in various ways. And it's basically a giant death orgy night. And that's the night that the hags and the death hags and the hag sorceresses tend to bathe themselves in cauldrons of blood to renew their youth, because it's like when they're the most powerful and all this other stuff. So outside of that, what I was going to say is that how you get assassins is that sometimes the witch elves will steal male infants, and instead of killing them, they'll basically adopt them into the order and turn them into the Blades of Cain, which are assassins, and they're trained from infancy. If they're a small child, they'll also accept them, but if they're any older than that, they'll just sacrifice or kill them. And these infants / young children are basically just very, very finely tuned into flawless and perfect killing machines, and that's how you get assassins. But assassins are an all-male order, because they're the flip side of the coin to the witch elves and the death hags. Everyone else, off the top of my head, even looking through some of my books, I'm fairly certain the rest of the Dark Elf orders / cultures / units are co-gendered, or have the ability to be co-gendered, depending on like who they have available to fight and all that stuff. So hopefully that answers your question. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one. The next question is, why are Dark Elves so good at shredding Chaos armies that attack from the waste to the north of Nagaroth? Are there any foes that they loathe facing in the lore? This is also from Druthella. So, the easiest answer to this is the reason the Dark Elves are so good at destroying Warriors of Chaos armies, or just Chaos in general, is because the Dark Elves have been practicing this for thousands and thousands of years. It's important to remember that the Dark Elves and the High Elves are the same race up until the Sundering, where they split. And within that vein, those who would become Dark Elves, like Malekith for instance, were wandering the world, fighting the forces of chaos all over the place, even long before they met the dwarves and forged an alliance with the dwarves. So by the time the Dark Elves were abandoned Ulthuan and went to Nagaroth, they had, way too much experience on knowing how to take down chaos using High Elf technology of all things. And at that point, the Dark Elves were basically able to cast off the shackles of morals and design weapons that were far more deadly, far more sadistic, and just flawlessly designed to just destroy their enemies. But on top of that, the Dark Elves also have the Towers of Sorcery, and the Towers of Prophecy, especially in Grand. But there's a whole network of towers that have sorceresses in them that line the northern border of Nagaroth, and these towers, which of course are led by Morthy, is kind of the head of that order, are able to use their prophetic powers to basically constantly watch the northern border of Nagaroth, and they always know when a Chaos Horde is coming long before they show up. Whether or not Morthy decides to tell anybody about it, or whether she decides to just let Chaos show up and cause some havoc, is a different story. But she at least always knows that they're coming. As far as are there any foes they loathe to face? The Dark Elves have a pretty embracing feeling towards battle and war in general. I think the only race that the Dark Elves are hesitant to go up against are the Demons of Chaos, particularly those led by Slaanesh, just because the Dark Elves are the only race that don't have a plan for when they die. Because when elves die, if they don't have some way to protect their souls, Slaanesh is going to devour them, which is apparently a pretty horrific experience, 9 times out of 10. When you die, best case scenario, if you're a Dark Elf, like Irithkial, who's the goddess of the underworld, will come and take your soul to be forced into her army that she keeps in the elven version of Hell, or it's more like Hades than Hell, where she basically binds you to her will, and she builds up, an army of these terrifying creatures that once were the spirits of elves in hopes of going to war with Ashurin at some point. But, yeah, that's probably the scariest legion for the Dark Elves, just because demons can kind of just show up, very unexpectedly, like if there's enough magic or if somebody screws up and rips open a portal to the wrong place at the wrong time, demons just show up and they're incredibly tough, and they are able to go toe-to-toe with the Dark Elves in a lot of ways. They have the magic to keep up with them, and they certainly have the combat ability to keep up with them. And Slaanesh in particular takes really perverse joy in messing with the Dark Elves. Elves are his favorite meat, so to speak. And where the High Elves are able to bind their souls into the Waystones, and the Wood Elves are able to feed their soul back into the forest, the Dark Elves don't have a plan. So I would say demons, especially when Slaanesh demons invade, that's probably the most concern that they get. They do not have a good time against that particular opponent. So hopefully that answers your question. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one. Let's see. T-Wolf88 asks, if Dark Elves draw on Chaos Sorcery for a lot of their power and are even physically warped by Chaotic Taint, why are they so seemingly independent of the Chaos Gods, and why do Chaos armies attack them? Okay, so there's a couple of minor questions wrapped up into one seemingly simple question, so I'll just kind of tackle each part of this. So first of all, if Dark Elves draw on Chaos Sorcery, that's not quite correct. So Dark Elves, of course, use the 8 winds of magic just like every other race in the fantasy universe does, but what's unique to them, sort of, is dark magic. And dark magic is, of course, when you just sort of smash all 8 of the winds together and unleash it as this horrible, garbled mess that causes tons of agony and pain and suffering. And the Dark Elves certainly invented it, with Morathi being the founder, and it's highly suggested that Morathi learned how to wield dark magic using demonic pacts. However, dark magic is not intrinsically chaos magic, just like any other form of magic is not chaos magic. Magic itself is chaos in a sense, except for it's being directed and controlled, which is why when magic rebounds, there's a chance that like a demon will spawn in your head and explode out like from Alien or something. And why the realm of chaos is just magic solidified and powered with emotion. So they don't really use chaos sorcery to power a lot of stuff. They for instance, have a lot of pacts. Many of their sorceries have like pacts with demons for knowledge and things like that. But those are more individual pacts as opposed to like a racial dealings with demons. Like Malekith doesn't have many relationships with demons. He's like struck a bargain with Nakari and some other stuff, but they were very open and closed deals, and Malekith kind of settled his debts, so to speak, with all of them. But he doesn't really like cavorting with chaos. Malekith views chaos as the enemy, whereas Morathi views it as a fuel source to make herself stronger. As for why they're physically warped by Chaotic Taint, that's also kind of a misconception. Elves are not warped by chaos in the way that like Chaos Dwarves are, or Warriors of Chaos, or Beastmen. Like Dark Elves don't suffer from mutations, and chaos is not an active part of their society. There is, of course, the Cult of Pleasure, which pre-8th edition, which is what Total War Warhammer 2 is based off of. The Cult of Pleasure is a Slaaneshi cult that Slaanesh is worshipped very actively, And that's why during the Storm of Chaos, when Archaon had his first unveiling and was, led his big invasion of the world, the Dark Elf faction from the Storm of Chaos was the Cult of Slaanesh, which was demons of Slaanesh and Dark Elves joining forces to invade Lustria. So that part of society is very influenced by Chaos. In 8th edition, it was kind of retconned because they invented a bunch of new elf gods, and one of them was Authority, who is the goddess of pleasure, and so the pleasure cults were more of her thing, but I personally prefer the version where it's Slaanesh because it makes more sense. I don't really like the expanded pantheon from 8th edition. I consider them canon, but I still think to say that the Cult of Pleasure that Morathi runs isn't heavily influenced by Slaanesh is false, because Morathi has such a wrapped up history with Slaanesh. It kind of does a disservice to the character to separate that from her, because Morathi is really interesting as being one of the only characters who's able to kind of successfully manipulate her relationship with Chaos and come out on top most of the time, when most people just completely fail at that and end up being subservient. So Dark Elves, in the main crux of that answer, are not warped by Chaos. They don't have physical attributes of Chaos. Like, they're more pale than their cousins of Wood Elves or High Elves, but that's because they live in Nagaroth, where it's much colder. The sun is almost never shining due to dark clouds and snow, and they are crueler in nature. And it's revealed, I guess you could say, or speculated that a long time ago, Chaos did kind of twist each of the races a little bit to basically make them more inclined to their failings, and the 3 elven races represent different aspects of those failings, where the Wood Elves became much more prone to isolationism and basically leaving the outer world to its fate, which is kind of their failing. The Dark Elves' failing was that they basically think that they are above all else, and they view everything as lesser than them, so they see no issue or conflict with torturing them, using them as slaves, all this other stuff, and turn kind of into monsters, at least soul-wise. They turn into these black twisted creatures on the inside, and that's their failing. And then the High Elves were twisted into becoming so arrogant that they honestly believed they were the only ones capable of saving the world, and everyone else was basically just peasants, and was either unworthy of joining them on the battlefield or weren't strong enough to feasibly help them, and the High Elves have to shoulder this burden alone, which is their ultimate failing. So that's kind of the only real influence, tangible influence, that Chaos has had on the Dark Elves. The Dark Elves are as much an enemy of Chaos as the other 2 elven races typically. The Dark Elves, the big difference is that Dark Elves are willing to ally with Chaos because all they give a damn about is accomplishing their own means, and they'll do anything to accomplish those means. But that doesn't mean Dark Elves like Chaos. Dark Elves want to be the top dog, and Chaos is something that views itself as bigger and better than them, and they don't appreciate that. So that's why they come to blows so often. As to why they're independent of the Chaos Gods, the Dark Elves, especially in 8th edition when we got the expanded Pantheon, the Dark Elves have plenty of their own kind of dark gods that they can worship, gods of kind of excesses and other things that really step into Chaos God territory, with Hekari, the goddess of sorcery, Authority, the goddess of pleasure, Cain, the god of murder, all the stuff, where these gods were kind of suspiciously chaotic, and they're very weirdly similar to the gods of chaos in many ways. Suspiciously so, I would even say. Cain and Khorne have a long established relationship, but even way back in 6th edition, there was a prevalent suggestion that maybe Cain and Khorne weren't completely different entities. 7th edition and 8th edition walked away from that and established them very strongly as different entities. But, in 7th edition, the Elven Pantheon only had one kind of bad guy, and that was Cain, with the rest of the Elven gods either being neutral or good. Kind of like how in the Empire, most of the gods there are good, but Mor and Mathlan can kind of be a bit on the neutral side. But, so they don't worship the Chaos Gods. They don't really have a relation. So the Dark Elves, they don't worship the Chaos Gods. They don't really have a relationship with the Chaos Gods. They're not physically or magically manipulated by them. And the reason Chaos armies attack them is because the Dark Elves are fair prey. You know, Slaanesh wants to feast on their souls. They've insulted the other gods plenty of times, and they may, you know, they may be evil, but they're still elves. And the Chaos gods are more than happy to kill them, especially since many of them, like Malekith, participated in the Great Cataclysm and, you know, had no small part in ruining and thwarting many of the gods' plans. And the gods hold a grudge. And plus, Chaos armies attack each other. Like, even two guys that are on the same god, you know, two Tzeentchian warlords will totally attack each other just out of spite or to one-up one another. So Chaos infighting and evil destruction forces infighting is not exactly rare. Alright, so let's go ahead and move on. Our next question comes from good old John Tang, who asks, there's a Dark Elf Separatist group, right? Okay, so he was retconned out of 8th edition, but there used to be a Dark Elf male sorcerer who operated a small... He shows up in the Malice Darkblade series as a fairly important character. So if you want to learn more about him, I would suggest reading Malice Darkblade. I think he's in the first 3 books, or the first omnibus. And he was basically a outcasted male Dark Elf sorcerer who was powerful enough to basically deal with and cast back Malekith's kind of paltry attempts to kill him. But he was also weak enough that Malekith wasn't willing to go completely whole ham and go after him. So he did exist at a certain time, but certainly in 8th edition he was basically retconned out of existence, because 8th edition did a lot more tying up of loose ends and tried to basically prepare all of the races just for end times events. So yes, there was a Dark Elf Separatist group. In the current canon, there is no longer a Dark Elf Separatist group. So that's really all you need to know about that. If you want to learn more about the character who did exist, whose name I cannot remember off the top of my head, I would highly recommend reading the Malice Darkblade series. And if you like Dark Elves in general, I would exceedingly recommend it, because the Malice Darkblade series is amazingly well written and will really help you get into the mindset of the Dark Elves, and it's a very, very fun series of stories. Let's go ahead and move on. Our next question comes from Marillion, who essentially asks that comparing the elven gods to the human gods, the elven gods appear not to have much magic, and that they tend not to grant great miracle works to their priests compared to humans. You know, you don't see like an elven version of Volkmar running out with a blazing hammer and making fire rain from the sky, and the R. Ulrich, you know, summoning winter storms and all that. So the answer to this is actually pretty straightforward. Elves do not see a difference between magic and priestly abilities. Like, if you were to ask Teclis about humans, he sees a warrior priest of Sigmar basically the same as a wizard. Just they use their faith essentially to channel magic and kind of get a bizarre result out of it. So to the elves, there isn't really such thing as a priest who can like call upon their god but not use magic. Like, they acknowledge that that's magic. So the elves do have many, many priests, and they are exceedingly powerful. You know, you have... but there's also kind of this weird thing, like 8th edition made it more complicated, because in 8th edition they stopped being so much elven priests of a god and started being just physical embodiments of said god, like their actual form. But a good example of a priest is like the Everqueen. The Everqueen is a priestess of Aisha, essentially. And she is exceedingly powerful and is able to channel the power and the will of Aisha and the land of Ulthuan itself by casting magic. And because of this, she is literally so strong that even when she's not at full power, just by touching a demon, she can just obliterate them. Like, she can literally walk up to a greater demon and just tap them with their finger, and they'll be incinerated in white fire if she's at moderate strength. So the elves have many, many powerful people who serve in priestly ways. Like, there have been elves who are essentially priests of Mathlon, and they are terrifying on the battlefield. You just don't really see them a lot because for the elves, there's just not really a discernible difference between someone who's just a powerful wizard and someone who is a priest for their god. That being said, of course, the elven gods do bless their children. It's just not as obvious and not as grandiose as when the human gods do it. You know, the human gods tend to answer prayers with very explosive, sudden changes in combat abilities. The elf gods tend to be a little bit more subtle about it, in that they basically bless their elves with abilities or teachings or insight, and the elves are much more, that kind of have a more casual relationship with their gods, and that they're not sitting there trying to draw their god's attention and basically try and interpret the really complicated will of Ulrich or any of this other stuff and shout to them and hoping that they'll buff them in battle. Instead, they go in knowing they have the tools from their gods with them already. You know, you see that in the war dancers, who are essentially Loek's tricksters, Loek the trickster god, and they go in there knowing his teachings, and basically they're performing dances that they learned from him, and they're performing stories, and while they're performing these, they're also casually and brutally murdering everyone in front of them. The Phoenix Guard could easily be said in the Anointed of Assurin, which is the Phoenix Guard captains, could very easily be considered to be priests of Assurin. And they are exceedingly powerful. They know the future. They know when they're going to die, which is why they never speak, because they're not supposed to share the future with anyone. And they basically walk out and just butcher people on battlefields, and are these exceedingly powerful warriors, and people are terrified of them because they don't make any noise, even when they get cut down or lose an arm or something. So, yeah, so elven gods are debatably more powerful than human gods. It's just that human gods tend to have very explosive and sudden shows of faith and force, which kind of matches the way that human belief works, whereas elves is a much more subtle and consistent flow of power. So hopefully that answers your question. I know it's maybe not like the most straightforward answer, but that's the best way I can think to explain it. There are a ton of similarities between the two, and I wouldn't say that either series of gods is more, like, explicitly more powerful than the other. But human gods are definitely a lot more showy with their power. So hopefully that answers your question. Okay, so this next series of questions isn't really like Dark Elf related. Some of them are, but a lot of these are really easy questions I can just answer really fast. So I'm just going to kind of put them all together. So will Sotek be doing Total War Warhammer 2? Yes I will. I've been playing it quite a bit. I'll admit I haven't really been like recording footage because I wanted to come back on a lore note and I wasn't really satisfied with a lot of things I've been making. But now that the next Legendary lore video is pretty much done and I'm really happy with it, I'm going to be back in force, and I'll probably put up gameplay footage, but there's plenty of stuff to talk about at the end of the video. Is it possible for Lord Croak to be raised from the dead by... Okay, to be raised from the dead by a vampire? No. Lord Croak isn't actually dead, he's just physically dead, but his spirit is still around and is, like, completely floating around his body and has dominion over it. It wouldn't be possible to raise him because you'd have to dominate his spirit, and dominating Croak would be just completely impossible. Even dominating a regular Slaawn would be impossible. The best thing a necromancer like Nagash could probably hope to accomplish is maybe convening with the Slaawn and maybe trying to like engage them in a duel to destroy them in a more permanent sense, but he couldn't reanimate their corpse. It would, the way Slaawn die, they all just kind of hover around their bodies unless they're like eaten by a chaos god or something. So that's not something that would necessarily be in their tool set. They can raise corpses, and when they do, they tend to pull the spirit from wherever it's wherever it exists, whether it's like sort of like memories implanted in the bones, or they drag it out of Mor's garden or Mor's realm, or all this stuff. Vampires tend to rely fairly heavily on bringing back some semblance of the soul of whatever it is they're raising. But for the Slann, you can't really do that because their soul's like right there, and they're still pretty powerful. Relic priests don't mess around; they're pretty strong. What made you choose Sotek in your name? Just your favorite of the gods? Yes, Sotek is my favorite god. When I was really young, I started collecting lizardmen, and Sotek wasn't really a big deal for the lizardmen until I was already playing, and then the Lustria campaign came out, and I thought it was the most amazing and epic thing I ever read in my life. And the fact it was a skink, of all things, who led the lizardmen to victory over the Skaven, I thought was just insanely badass. And I just love the story of Sotek's resurrection so much. Could spawning pools that were lost or poisoned ever be repaired? And that question was asked by that pirate. The race question was asked by Jabba 4, and John Tang asked if I would be doing Warhammer 2. Sorry, I forgot about that. So Alan Bobaru asked, could the spawning pools that were lost or poisoned ever be repaired? And if yes, do the lizardmen have a way to do it? Could they be repaired? Possibly. Probably. Maybe. Do the lizardmen have a way to do it? Not in the canon lore. The spawning pools were these, to the lizardmen, insanely mystical and impossible to understand creations that basically are able to endlessly produce lizardmen according to timetables installed by the old ones super long time ago, with genetic code and all this other stuff designed to make sure that the lizardmen came out perfectly designed for whatever task was at hand. When the Skaven poisoned them, you can think of them as really delicate machines, and the Skaven basically poured a bunch of acid into the inner workings and totally messed it up, and the lizardmen don't possess the knowledge anymore to know how the spawning pools even work, much less how to fix them. Otherwise, the lizardmen would have long ago probably been able to take over the spawning pools and force spawnings of their own design to come out. And in the canon lore, the lizardmen are not able to manipulate that. They don't understand how it works. The best they can do is read the plaques and know when a spawning, hope they know when a spawning is going to spawn. But even a lot of the time, they get caught off guard. Marcus Navargard asks, what of the Femur? I'm assuming you're asking what are the Femur. So I'm going to try and keep this particular answer short, because that can actually be a long answer of that. The Femur are a really, really old race in the Warhammer world who existed before the Dark Gods, before the Chaos Gods came to the world. And when the Chaos Gods came to the world, the Femur, much like the Dragon Ogres, struck a bargain with them. And so for a time, a very limited time, the Femur were kind of the favored servants of the Chaos Gods. But then humanity came along and struck their own bargain with the Chaos Gods, and the Chaos Gods were much more entertained, fed, and interested in humanity than in the Femur. So the Femur kind of went from being Chaos's favorite child to being the rejected adopted one. And the Femur are very resentful of this. As for what they are, the Femur are basically these, you can see them in Warhammer 1. They're Cyclopean lizard monsters. They used to have some pretty dark lore about them. Something that they were pretty infamous for is that they would appear in fog and take women, basically, and take them back to the swamps and rape them, and it was really, really dark. They kind of got rid of some of that, and now they're just sort of these evil swamp monsters that worship chaos, and when they see an opportunity to further their own glory and catch the Dark God's attention, whether that's by killing their current champions or attacking the Empire or whatever, they'll come out of the swamps with the mists, of course, following them as part of their curse, I guess you could say. And the mist is what obscures them and makes them really dangerous, because you'll just find yourself in a really deep fog, and all of a sudden there's these hulking lizard monsters in there that are just capable of, killing a guy on a horse with a single blow. So hopefully that answers your question. Next from Shere Khan is... I have a question. What would happen theoretically if the lizardmen killed all of the High Elves and the Dark Elves? Okay, so I'm going to first say that that's a big theoretically, because the lizardmen would never kill the High Elves. The High Elves are part of the Great Plan. What the lizardmen would prefer to do is force all of the Dark Elves and the Wood Elves to go back to Ulthuan and force them to live in harmony, because that's where they're supposed to be. If all of the High Elves, for some reason, did something that the Lizardmen were like, oh shit, they're not part of the Great Plan, we have to kill them all, then they would just exterminate them, and Ulthuan would be empty, and it would be really sad, because the Lizardmen would have permanently failed the Great Plan at that point. As for what they would try and do, the Slann would probably do their best to basically recreate the High Elves. I don't think they would be very successful, though. Let's see. Alright, so, oh, I can't even read it. Lolply asks, how did Dark Elves' culture diverge so much from the High Elves one? I mean, they were once High Elves in origin. How many years did it take them to change? So, the Dark Elves were actually kind of the way they are long before the Sundering. When Anarion drew the Sword of Cain, he kind of ushered in a new age for the High Elves, where those who were close to and essentially worshipped Anarion, you know, like they were incredibly fond of him and they were very focused on him. The elves used to have a much more martial focus in their world during the Age of the Demons, because the demons could attack at any time, and everyone had to be ready to fight tooth and nail not to get slaughtered. And especially after the Everqueen Astariel died and Anarion remarried Morathi, Anarion kind of started to well, that's when he drew the Sword of Cain, actually, is when after Astariel died. But especially after he married Morathi, Anarion kind of started falling into a deep darkness and kind of was more and more twisted into this terrible figure of cruelty and malice. His court in the city of Anlek became notorious for being a place of darkness and horrible cruelty and just being exceedingly dangerous, and most other High Elves were terrified of Anarion. Kalidor Dragon Tamer, who was of course Anarion's friend, basically went to confront him and was like, I don't know what's gotten into you, but you need to stop this, and it's because of the Sword of Cain, primarily, because that was the way the Curse of Cain inflicted itself on Anarion, was it started driving him mad, and you know, Anarion basically told Kalidor off, and that's when Kalidor decided to cook up the idea for the Vortex, but he did not tell Anarion until he had already started to enact it, because he didn't trust Anarion, because Anarion had become so full of hatred and rage and battle lust that he was much closer to what the Dark Elves are today than what the High Elves are today. Of course, in the final battle, Anarion decided to side with Kalidor, much to the surprise of many people who thought that he would turn against Kalidor. Morathi probably wanted him to turn against Kalidor, but Anarion in the end decided to be the ultimate good guy and basically fought, you know, the greatest of the four powers and cut down their armies and held them off long enough for the Vortex to be enacted, and that's why he's remembered as Anarion the Defender. But many elves, High Elves in particular, like to forget that the last good portion of Anarion's life, he was cruel and bloodthirsty and was kind of a monster. And that was reflected in all of his servants, and Nagaryth, which is the nation he was from, which used to be a very powerful nation before the Sundering completely wrecked it, was a nation that was very notorious for how cruel the elves there tended to be and bloodthirsty. And then on top of that, Morathi started the pleasure cults, which started to infiltrate elven society, and basically, because after the great cataclysm and the elves were in the golden age, many elves got very bored and started to pursue interests, and Morathi played to their weakness of wanting something to do and being bored, and basically drew them into the worlds of excess, you know, worlds of pleasure and obsession and doing everything way more than they should, and indulging in just the complete madness that they were bringing around themselves. So the infection that became the Dark Elves was long established, hundreds, if not thousands of years before the Sundering. The Sundering was just when it all came to a head, and everyone, all the elves who were filled with that cruelty, that boredom, that desire, all, you know, sided with Malekith when he murdered a bunch of princes, and all the other High Elves were like, no, this is wrong, and that's when the Civil War started. So the Dark Elves culture, although it has certainly gotten worse since the Sundering, the Dark Elves, as as the concept of kind of sadistic elves who are so beyond arrogant that it's unbelievable, and they believe themselves the most superior race and are just cruel beyond measure. They've been around for almost since the Cataclysm. They've just gotten worse as the centuries and millennia have rolled by. Next, someone asked, what interactions have the Saurians, I'm assuming you mean lizardmen, Saurians are only a subspecies, have had with races like the dwarves? And Two Kings are also mentioned, and this is from Anthrosunian. So this question is actually fairly easy to answer. The dwarves have had quite a few impacts with the lizardmen. Obviously, the lizardmen are a fairly mysterious race to everyone in the world because they tend to not like outsiders very much. Zlatlan, for instance, Karak Zorn was, of course, the first of the dwarven cities. It's their origin. And the lizardmen were actually the ones who exterminated all the dwarves inside. Why they did that is kind of a mystery. My going theory has been the dwarves who lived in Karak Zorn became more and more obsessed with collecting riches and gold and started stealing from the lizardmen, started waging war on them. And the lizardmen of the Southlands were not as well guided as the lizardmen of Lestria, and so they finally reached a point where they must have decided that the best thing to do was to basically attack Karak Zorn to take back their treasure, and the dwarves probably fought to the last man, and the lizardmen wiped them out. Of course, there have been many, many famous tales of dwarves exploring Lestria. There's one dwarf who took an ironclad ship, and he was, I forget exactly what happened to him, but he was kind of disgraced, and he basically went to Lestria to seek his fortune, and so he basically chugged up and down the Amazon River looking for treasure, and he had running battles with the lizardmen where they clashed a lot. Dwarves really like gold, and they really like to take from the lizardmen, and the lizardmen really don't appreciate it. As for the Tomb Kings have battled the lizardmen many times, the lizardmen of the Southlands. The Lestrian lizardmen have probably gone into conflict with them probably few enough times you could count it on two hands, because those were probably global spanning events that were exceedingly rare. But the Southlands lizardmen have attempted to push up into Nehekhara for their own means, whether to recover lost plaques or just because they were seeking to correct some fault in the Great Plan, and they've battled with the Tomb Kings. There's a very famous battle that features, well, I wouldn't say very famous, but notable battle that happened in the Big Red Book, which is the rule book for 8th edition, the really big one, that tells of a time when the Southlands led a full-scale invasion, the lizardmen of Nehekhara, for some unknown means, and the Tomb Kings managed to defeat them by basically reflecting the sun's rays through a bunch of mirrors on top of the pyramids and created the death ray that exists in our world. It doesn't actually work in our world, but in the Tomb Kings world it definitely worked. And they basically were able to vaporize or burn to death a bunch of the big dinosaurs and force the lizardmen to retreat. So the lizardmen have had a pretty tumultuous relationship with many of the other races in the world. They don't tend to get along. Hopefully that answers your question. Alright, so there are some other questions, but I'm pretty much at the hour mark, and I want to kind of talk for a few minutes. So the last question I'm going to answer for today, we'll start the end, which is, Sotek, are you still trying to do a narrative campaign? The answer is yes. I did a vote with the patrons, and the vote ended up being for a Skarsnik campaign. And my goal, which I think was 4 months ago now, was to make a narrative campaign where I would put out the Skarsnik lore video, and then I would play through his narrative campaign. That still is the plan. I think what's going to happen instead is I'll probably do a week or so, or maybe a series, where I release the lore videos for Skarsnik, Belegar, and Queek in a very rapid succession, and then I'll probably put out 2 videos, one being about Karak 8 Peaks itself, and one being about the war that was originally fought for the 8 Peaks and what happened and why the dwarves were pushed out. And once all of that is out, or maybe while that's coming out, I will play a Skarsnik narrative campaign. So hopefully that's something everyone wants to see and would be interested. I'm not going to lie, it's going to be a lot of work, but it's something I would like to do. So let's talk about the channel. So I've been gone now for at least 4 months. And that was after I was pretty much gone for 3 months I think before that, I don't remember exactly what it was. I think I've been kind of on and off since last May. But in any event, so I'm back to stay is the goal. I'm going to be continuing to do Q&As. I'm going to try and do them weekly. I don't want to give a complete commitment to exact timetables because I'm back in college and doing some other stuff, just life. But I have enough time to focus on YouTube again, and it's something that I would like to do. So I've got a lot of stuff I'm going to be putting out that aren't straight on lore videos. For instance, later this week, I'm going to be putting out a video of people that I recommend you guys watch. If you're just looking for interesting Warhammer content that's not mine, or you're looking for something that, you're like, oh, I've watched all of Sotek's videos and I want something else to fill my time. There are some people who I've watched that I would recommend who do stuff different than me. And so that's something I'm looking to do soon. Of course, I will be putting some links. So in the comment section for this video, I'm actually going to put links to 2 podcasts I did with a YouTuber called Italian Spartacus. And it would actually mean a lot to me if you guys would head over there and check those videos out. Hit the like button if you enjoy it. And if you want to see him do more stuff with me or vice versa, let us know. Go down into the comment section on that podcast and say, I really enjoyed this. I'd love to see more of this. I have some other things I'm hoping to do with other YouTubers like Italian, YouTubers who kind of have similar lore backgrounds. I would say that I still feel pretty confident in being kind of the king of 8th edition or current, so to speak, lore. But there are a lot of people out there who have really interesting ideas and know more about older lore than I do, which can help shape our view on the way the lore is now. It can help shape how maybe certain decisions were selected and inspired for Total War Warhammer. Of course, I want to get back into discussing Total War Warhammer news and things like that, future DLCs and all that jazz. God knows I'm late to those parties. But hopefully that's all stuff you guys want to see. Something y'all can do that would really help me out is if you would let me know down in the comment section what kind of content you guys want to see. Now that I'm back, I only really want to work on stuff that y'all want to see. I don't really want to waste my time on stuff that people aren't going to watch, just because I don't have unlimited time, and it hurts my voice to talk for this long. So if there's stuff you guys want to see, or something you're like, man, I really wish Sotek would do this, like if the narrative Let's Play sounds like a cool idea, or you just want to see regular Total War Warhammer 2 gameplay, or you want to see my opinion on it, or you just want to see Legendary Lord videos, feel free to say what you like, what you hate in your comments. Have a like category, have a hate category, and just let me know. I read everything y'all post. I do, even though I don't respond as much anymore, just because there's a lot of comments. I hope you guys are all doing well. I really hope you're going to enjoy the Lord video. For patrons, it comes out tomorrow. For everyone else, it'll probably come out on Wednesday, I'm going to say. Just because I'm going to run it for the patrons for a few days without ads, and then when it comes out for everyone, I'll tack some ads on it and stuff. And hopefully I don't get slapped with like non-ad friendly content, because since I've been gone, the adpocalypse happened, so we'll see how that runs down. In any events, thank all you guys for sticking around. It means more than I can say that just through all the shit I've been going through in my personal life and just everything I've had to deal with, the channel has somehow consistently grown over my absence, and now we're basically at 10,000 subs, which is fucking mind-blowing. I don't know what happened. I'm going to be totally honest with you guys. I have no idea what's going on. So, I'm going to have to make a thank you video for that when we actually hit it. I don't know what we're going to do for that. We'll have to do something. But I hope you guys enjoyed the lore video that's coming out this week. My goal is to get out a bunch of Legendary Lords as fast as I can for a bit. So we kind of might go back to a format where there are more picture videos and less like actual footage. All the talking is still there, but maybe there's less like gameplay footage. I don't know. We'll see how y'all feel about the one that's coming out, and everybody hates it. We'll figure it out. So thanks for sticking around. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Pretty much in an hour, so I'm going to go ahead and stop this. I hope you're able to listen to this when you're driving to work or having breakfast and just kind of pause it. I'll try and I'll see if I can throw in timestamps. In any event, I hope you guys are all having a great time. Please go to the links I post down in the comment section to watch the podcast between myself and Italian Spartacus. Give him, please hit the subscribe button over there if you like what you see. Give that video a like. Show him, if you like me working with other YouTubers, now is a great time to show that. And show that you want me to be over there. So hope you all have a great time. I will be back with more news and more videos very soon. I promise no more 6 months off. I'll see you guys soon. Bye.